Hello students, welcome back. Time to start a new unit, the unit on Pacem and Terris, which was published in 1963 by Pope John XXIII. The encyclical title means peace on earth, and that is what the encyclical is concerned with. Pope John XXIII knew he was dying of cancer while he wrote this encyclical. He died 2 months after it was published. He published it during the Second Vatican Council, which is not normal for a pope to publish an encyclical as a council goes on. That shows, I think, the importance that he gave to this encyclical as one of the last things that he did on earth and as something that he published during a council. What is the context of this? I'm going to give two contexts for this in the history at the time. One is the Cold War. The Cold War lasted from about the end of World War II until 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down. The Cold War was the world powers, above all the United States of America and the USSR, threatening one another with nuclear weaponry, recognizing that the other had the power to totally destroy their nation and to kill most, if not all, of the people in that nation, and making sure that they could send something back to destroy their nation as well. The idea being to, through the principle of what was called mutually assured destruction, to make sure that there was deterrence, that if one group shot, they knew they were going to be destroyed, so they're very likely not to fire off nuclear weaponry. This was a very tense and terrifying time. If you look at the literature of the period, like Dr. Strangelove, you can see that this was kind of an overwhelming fear that people had, that they, their children, their whole life could be snuffed out in the blink of an eye if nuclear weapons were fired. The whole world, as we know it, could be destroyed. Well, in 1963, there was a particularly strong sense of fear because the Cuban Missile Crisis had been narrowly avoided. Thanks be to God, it was avoided. Nuclear weapons weren't fired between the USA and the USSR. But the whole world saw this could easily have gone the other way. So it was a time of justified fear of nuclear war. The Pope called for mutual disarmament. He said that the arms race could never build a lasting peace, that lasting peace could only come about by building trust between countries, not fear. He did not necessarily condemn one country building up weaponry if the other refused to stop doing so. He doesn't talk about that explicitly, but what he does call for is agreement between the two parties, between the USSA and the USA and the USSR, that the two parties agree to stop building up weaponry and come to some sort of plan of gradual disarmament where each can kind of oversee what the other is doing, making sure that someone's not cheating on their side of the treaty. He really wants that to happen. Another important context for this encyclical is the injustice practiced in many countries throughout the world, and in particular, I think, the injustice practiced under Marxist regimes. Looking at the USSR as a striking example of this, you had in the USSR many freedoms, many human rights that were pushed down very intensely. So, for example, all media was controlled by the state. Outside media was prohibited as far as that was possible in order that people would not be able to think about things, or at least have help in thinking about things that were contrary to the communist ideas. You had voting. Now, voting was allowed, but all of the candidates were chosen by the Communist Party. So you didn't really have any other option other than the Communist Party chosen people when you voted. Religious liberty was at least strongly curtailed. It wasn't absolutely forbidden to be religious, but religion was ridiculed, was pressed down. Atheism was aggressively pushed within the schools. Church property was taken away. Oppression in different ways of people who were religious, keeping them out of positions of authority, certainly, but also torture, imprisonment, even death for people who were religious, and especially religious leaders, was commonplace in the USSR. There was no right to assemble to attain political ends or labor ends. All of those associations that were legal were run directly by the state, and so pushed the normal propaganda. There were show trials that were conducted in order to give the appearance of justice, but the decision was already made before the trial began. So this was a context for Pacem and Terris. And you see that, I think, in what the Pope stresses. First, the dignity of the human person, that the person does not exist for the state, but the state for the person. He goes through rights that seem like many of them, ones that are on exactly the opposite side from what would happen in the USSR and other Marxist nations. He emphasizes the right to worship God, the right of freedom of religion, the right to assemble and to attain important ends, the right to take part in politics in an active, free way, the right to justice within the community, a right to life, to not be killed, a right to seek truth and not have that kept from you. All of these seem to be exactly on the other side from Marxism, which is why I think that is an important context for the Pope's encyclical. One more thing before we end. This is not really an historical context, but something that I think is important, an important theme of the encyclical that I'd like to bring here. The Pope starts the encyclical in this way. I found this very striking. Peace on earth, which man throughout the ages has so longed for and sought after, can never be established, never guaranteed, except by the diligent observance of the divinely established order. What he means by that, he draws out later on. He's talking about the natural law and the eternal law. The natural law is the law of our nature, how we live well as human beings specifically. That's our nature, our personal human nature. Natural law is that's inscribed in us from the eternal law, which is the truth about himself that is known by God for all eternity. We, in our nature, are a particular reflection of the eternal law of God, of his goodness, and we live well by living in accordance with that law inscribed within our being. An example of acting against that is when persons are considered as disposable for the sake of some higher goal, as happened in the USSR, when people were considered explicitly to be expendable so that the Marxist revolution could go on its way to attain its final end. It's purely consequentialist. You can use people however you want as long as you're attaining some greater good. The Pope's idea is exactly contrary to that. Another aspect in which we violate the natural law and in so doing work against peace is actually through sin. Sin that's rooted in us. Think of the deadly sins, avarice, lust, envy. Those sins rooted in us lead us to injustice. If it weren't for seeking things in a way that is unfitting to us as human beings, or a way that's too strong, too much, we would never do injustice. If there were no avarice, there would never have been slavery. So the first place where justice has to happen is within ourselves. We need to become well ordered according to the natural law. We need to love things in the right way at the right time, etc., to seek the proper order within ourselves so that we then can be a force for justice in the world rather than being those who kind of seek our own ends too much in the wrong way and become part of the problem, the injustice that leads to war, that leads to lack of peace. In the encyclical, it seems to me that is stated here in this wonderful quote that you see on the page within the person, the problem of sin. Then you have, he talks about the relationship between human and human, that needs to be just, between nation and persons, that needs to be just. And then only does he talk about relationship between nation and nation. At all these different levels, person, between us, between nation and person, and between nations, there needs to be justice if there's going to be peace. God bless you. See you soon.